Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. My name is Nicole. Today we're here because I want to talk to you about pattern drafting for knitting, and what I'm going to explain to you today will also apply to crochet, so if you're interested in creating patterns for whatever type of craft it is, this is going to work. If you're wondering what my credentials are, I don't know what I'd call myself, maybe a fiber artisan. I don't really identify myself as an artist because I know that art is not necessarily about message, but I feel like I have zero message to pass through. So my focus when I'm creating is quite literally making the best version of whatever I'm trying to achieve. That's literally my focus, trying to achieve perfection. I don't know what that says about myself, but anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm fully self-taught at the University of the Internet. I've been creating patterns for the past 4 years. Even though I don't have a traditional education in this field, these past 4 years have been fully immersive. I've spent a lot of time refining my techniques and figuring out what works best for me. So I think that I've reached a sweet spot where I can explain and show to you everything that I've learned. It might not be everything, but it's condensed into a nice little package that will help you in your pattern making journey, I hope. The idea for this video started because I often get questions like, how do you create patterns for the knitting machine? And this type of questions leads me to think that there's some sort of misconception when it comes to creating patterns, that depending on the craft that you're using, whether it is sewing, hand knitting, machine knitting, or crochet, that the way you draft a pattern is different. But whatever type of fiber art you're using to achieve a shape, the starting point is always the same. You need to know what's the shape that you're trying to achieve. With sewing, you basically stop at drafting the pattern because then you can just cut your fabric into the shape that you've created. But when you're knitting and crocheting, you're creating your own fabric, so you have to turn that shape into a combination of stitches and rows, and that combination of stitches and rows is what will lead you to that desired shape. I can only speak for myself, but my starting point, wherever craft I'm working with, is to actually draft a pattern, and to do that I start with my pattern block, or as it's usually called in sewing, a sloper. So what's a pattern block in a little bit more detail? It's a foundation pattern. It typically includes just the essential parts of the pattern, like for example for a top it will include the front, back and the sleeves. It's made to your measurements, so it should fit accurately and closely to your body measurements. So it doesn't include any type of ease, it's not oversized, it's not cropped, it's not flared, it's just a neutral body fitting base. And why is this useful in your pattern making process, might you ask? So basically, once you have a pattern block, you can easily change it to create new designs. Since you already know that that base fits you, it's very likely that whatever change you're going to make to the pattern will fit you as well. For example, if you want to create a puff sleeve, you can just alter the sleeve to add volume. If you would like a cropped version, you can just shorten the torso. If you'd like to change the neckline, you can modify it on the existing block. Of course, if you're going for something more oversized, you might not need that block, but the more fitted you'd like your garments to be, the more useful it is to have that solid foundation to start from. If you're interested in drafting your own pattern block, and I swear it's not as difficult as it might sound, but if you'd like to draft your own, I'm going to leave some links down below with some useful resources. Okay, but if you still find these all very overwhelming, I have another option that's always a good one, because I don't think that I'm overestimating when I say that all of us have at least one piece of clothing that we really like the fit of, so I think that's a really great place to start. And if you'd like to learn how to take the measurements from that pre-existing garment, keep watching because that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. So grab the garment of your choice. I'm going to use this top, but this could be done with pretty much anything. I'm using a top because I think that's what most people end up knitting, so for the sake of trying to reach the largest amount of projects that you might be trying to achieve, we'll go with the top. Hi, so I'm currently editing this video and just wanted to let you know that if you're not interested in copying a garment and you're just going to draft your own patterns, skip ahead to the next chapter. This is quite a long video, so feel free to skip to chapters that are more relevant to your learning process right now, I guess. Okay, back to the video. Go ahead and grab a ruler, some measuring tape or whatever measuring contraption you'd like to use, a pencil, an eraser because it's very likely that you'll have to make changes to your plans, and lastly, a piece of paper. We'll start off by drawing each individual shape of our pattern and try to draw it at a scale at which you can then write notes. My plans usually look like this, so keep that in mind. Now, the pattern pieces that you're going to draw will obviously depend on the shape of your garment. As you can see, the back of this top is done with some drop shoulder shaping, and I'm going to replicate these design features so that I can show you how to account for partial knitting or short rows. And I'm going to use the same type of construction so that I can show you how short row shaping is calculated. So let's start with the front. I'm analyzing my garment to see where the increases and decreases are done or where the curves are created, just so that I can have an idea on how the pattern pieces will be shaped. But yeah, let's start drawing them. This garment is symmetrical, so I'm just going to draw half of the front. I'm just going to draw the neckline shaping. I'm analyzing the garment to see if there's any sort of slope at the back where the front connects with the back, but I just follow along the same row of stitches and this line is perfectly straight at the front. And here it will go into a straight line. And as you can see here, if we follow along the same column of stitches, we can see that there's this little triangle where they increase stitches to create the armhole shaping. So I'm going to account for that. So it will go inward a little bit. And then we'll measure. This might not be proportional to the actual garment, but it doesn't really matter at this point. We just have to draw the shape so that we can associate the measurements to something. So here it just goes down. Here at the armhole we'll have a few stitches that have been cast off, but in this garment it isn't actually that much. It basically starts decreasing right away, but instead of just doing a straight line across, I'm just going to do just a small part where there will be stitches that have been cast off. And here is more or less where the ribbing starts. When it comes to measuring the garment, I like to start at the bottom. The bottom width is the first measurement that I take, but I'm not going to take the measurement at the ribbing. I'm going to take it at this section. And I'll have to keep it a little bit stretched just because the ribbing is stitching in at the bottom, so I'll have to keep it stretched to have the actual width. And it's 46 centimeters, so I'm going to insert that measurement here at the bottom. So we have here it's 46 centimeters, but as I'm only drafting half of the front pattern, I'm going to divide this number by 2, so it's 23 centimeters, and we're going to do that for any measurement that's horizontally on the garment. Now I'm going to measure the width at the armhole, and here it's 51 centimeters. So here we have 51, which will be 25.5 centimeters. Now I'm going to measure from the neckline, and this neckline is finished with a folded collar, so I'm going to measure below that line because this height in the collar will be added when I knit the collar, and right now we're only accounting for the body of the top. So the height of this top is 42.5 centimeters, so I'm going to write that down. And I can actually measure how tall the ribbing will be, which is 11 centimeters. So I'm going again to write that down. Now we're getting to the armhole section, and as I told you earlier, there aren't any cast off stitches at the bottom of the armhole, but that's something that I really think that improves fit, so I'm just going to insert here 1 centimeter. So it won't change that much from the original design. And now when it comes to measuring curves, I like to look at curves as if they were triangles. So I measure the height of the triangle, which in this case it will stop about here, so it's 6 centimeters. So I'm going to input that measurement here. I quite literally draw the triangle, and I know that the height is 6 centimeters and that the width of this triangle is 5 centimeters. Now I'm going to measure from where the armhole shaping stops until where the shoulder shaping at the top starts, and that is 10 centimeters. So definitely my drawing isn't to scale, but from what I can see, the shoulder shaping at the top starts about where the neckline starts as well, so I'm just going to redraw this line. And here we have 10 centimeters. Oh, actually, I drew this part way too tall from what I'm getting from looking at the garment. So yeah, it stops about here. So the height of the neckline is, let's measure it, it's 10 centimeters. So the height here, it's 10 centimeters. And what I like to do at the neckline is to measure and see where we start getting any sort of shaping. So whenever it starts running out, that's where I'll start doing the shaping. So in this t-shirt, it's about 5 centimeters at the center of the neckline. So here it will be 5 centimeters. And now I'm going to do the same that I did for the armhole. So I'm going to look at this as a triangle. So our triangle is going to be 5 centimeters. And let's see what's the height. It's 6 centimeters. So let's input that info. And now I'm just going to pull this so that I can lay this fabric flat. And now for this shoulder shaping, we'll just have to measure what's the height of the shoulder shaping and what's the width. So we'll know how many stitches we have to increase in how many rows. And that will be 3.5 centimeters at the top. And the height is 7.5. Now I'm just going to measure the shoulder width, which is 12.5 centimeters, and I'm going to remove the 3.5 centimeters, which means it will be 9 centimeters. Here, let me just double check to see if that measurement is correct. Yes, and it seems to be. So let's see, what else do we need? Oh yeah, we need to know what's the height in this part where we're just going to work straight, because we already know that we stop here with the neckline shaping. And what I'm going to do is measure the whole height of the neckline, and I'm going to remove the 6 centimeters that I had already measured for the neckline shaping, so that we can get as exact of a measurement as possible. It would be around 9.5. So if we take out the 6 centimeters, that means that here at the top we'll have 3.5 centimeters. I think that's pretty much it for our measurements. We need to know what's the side seam. And so that we can make these as accurate as possible, I'm just going to measure it actually, and then I'm going to see what the side seam would be if I made the calculations based on the measurements that we already have. So we know that our full height at the front is 42.5 centimeters plus 10 centimeters, so that would be 52.5 centimeters. And I'm going to remove everything that isn't the side seam so that I know how tall the side seam would be. So these minus 11 minus 6 minus 10 minus 7.5. This should tell me what the side seam will be. So let's check. So it says that it's 18 centimeters. Let's measure to see if it actually is. We're off by around half a centimeter, so yeah, it's not that big of a deal. I'm just going to write down 18 centimeters so that it checks out with all of the other measurements that we have already inserted. Okay, we are all done with our measurements for the front, so now we're going to move on to the back. But I'm going to keep the measurements for the front nearby because I'm going to use some of them for the back, like the side seams, the size of the ribbing, the size of the shoulder seam, so we'll keep that nearby. And now let's draw our back shape. Again, I'm only going to draw half of the back. I'm only guesstimating the sizes of the shape here, but then we're going to draw these more accurately when it comes to proportions, so don't worry about it too much. Now again, here at the back, at the armhole, I'm going to replicate what I did for the front, so I'll just add a little spot where we're going to cast off stitches at the armhole, and now we can start taking our measurements. So I already know what's the width here at the armhole, so I'm just going to write that down. Right away, it's 25.5 centimeters. Here it's 23. I'm sorry, I got a little bit sidetracked. I started inputting measurements when we're still trying the shape. But yeah, here at the top, we basically have this trapezoid shape. So we'll have a straight line here, and then we'll have a slope. Here we'll have the armhole curve, and now we just have to draw a line that joins these 2 points. So here's somewhat of our back shape. Again, it might not be totally accurate when it comes to replicating the shape on the top, but it doesn't matter. We'll fix that later. So let's start by taking our measurements. Again, we're going to look at the armhole as a triangle. So I'm going to measure what's the width, and it's 6 centimeters. And the height is 5.5. Now let's measure this straight line at the neckline. It's 15.5 total, so half of that will be 7.75 centimeters. And here at the shoulder, it will be 13 centimeters. Let me just measure these to see if it corresponds to the total measurement. So it would be 13 times 2 and 7.75 times 2, which would be, so it's giving me 41.5 centimeters. So it's definitely bigger than the measurement that we have here. And it's because I measured the slope like this, but actually I have to measure it like this. So I'm going to place my measuring tape, and I'm going to place the ruler where the slope ends, and we'll see what's the width of this triangle. Yeah, it's about 11 centimeters. Let's now check again. So it would be 22 centimeters plus 15.5, 37.5. Yeah, that's a little bit more accurate. I'm going to measure the full width, which would be 36.5, and half of that would be 18.25. So of these 18.25, I'm going to remove 11 centimeters, and that will give me 7.25 instead of the 7.75. Now I'm just going to measure the height where the armhole shaping stops and where the shoulder shaping stops as well, or starts, depending on whether you're starting bottom up or top down. But let's measure this height. It will be 9 centimeters. And now I just have to measure the height at the back. Again, measuring below the neckline finish, and it's 52 centimeters. We're done with the measurements for the back, so let's move on to the sleeves. Now, when it comes to the sleeves, we'll have to analyze the garment to see if the sleeves are the same for the back and for the front. There's usually a different curve at the front than it is at the back, and vice versa. So let's look at it and see if there's actually any difference. I think that for this top there isn't actually. I'm going to take the measurements for the front and for the back to see if there's actually any difference, but if your sleeve is the same, you can again just draw half of the sleeve. So on this sleeve, definitely it starts getting wider the more it moves up, so we'll have a diagonal here and here as well. And here we'll just have that little straight line that we drew for the front and also for the back. And here it will be the ribbing section. Now, from what it looks like, this sleeve will somewhat look like this. Maybe not even as wide at the top, but it doesn't matter if it's not super proportional to the actual garment right now. So let's start by taking our measurements. I'm going to first measure what's the length of the sleeve, and it's 11 centimeters, of which 3 centimeters are for the ribbing. Now let's measure here at the top what's the section that is just cast off, and you have to try to lay it as flat as possible. So it's 7 centimeters. And again, we're going to look at this section that's a diagonal as if it were a triangle. So I'm going to place a ruler at the end of the shaping, and another one at the start so that we can see what are the measurements for this triangle. So it will be 12 centimeters wide and for the height it will be 13 centimeters. Okay, this is pretty much what we need for the sleeve, but I'm just going to measure the other side to see if there's any difference in this triangle, to see if the increase or decrease rate is different. Okay, it's pretty much the same measurements. So we're just going to do both front and back of the sleeve symmetrical, so it will be even easier. Okay, I'm sorry, I was just writing down my notes at the computer and I realized that I didn't measure the width of the sleeve. And to do that, you just have to, having it folded in half, you'll just have to measure along a straight line before the armhole starts and double that measurement to find out what's the full width, and the same at the bottom. And like we did for the front, we just have to stretch it out a little bit because the ribbing makes this section smaller than it actually is. So again, do the same, double the measurement and insert it in your notes. Now I'm going to clean up these sketches and I'm going to draw them out on Illustrator so that I can make all of these measurements proportional and they will actually translate into a shape that closely resembles the garment that we've been copying. And then we can move on to translating everything that we have here to stitches and rows. Welcome to my computer. I've just drawn out all of the shapes based on the measurements that I took from the top. So here are my 3 pattern pieces. If you're coming from having designed your own sloper, you are now at a very similar stage, whether it is on paper or on Illustrator, it doesn't really matter, it's the same. As long as the measurements are accurate to real-life proportions, it's perfectly fine whichever method you prefer to use. I like to do it digitally, but if you'd prefer to do it on paper, it's perfectly fine. So here are my pattern pieces. If you're coming from having drafted your own sloper, it's very likely that your lines when it comes to neckline shaping and everything will be curved like this, but either way you can't have it as straight as this is or as curved as your sloper is. So I'd recommend that if you've drafted your own pattern block and you have those curved lines, that you turn them into triangles. And what I like to do to soften these lines is to add an anchor point at the center of the triangle. It doesn't necessarily have to be the center, but anyway. And I like to drag it so that, again, I can soften this line. It might still look way too straight, but fabric that has been knit has a sort of elasticity to it, so you won't notice that these lines are straight, so it's not much of a problem. Based on the top that I'm copying, the armhole shaping was really a straight line, so I'm going to keep it like this. Now we've come to the point where we need our swatch, because we're going to turn all of those measurements that we have in our drawing into stitches and rows. And to know how many stitches and rows we have to base all of those measurements in a swatch. We'll have to figure out how many stitches and rows we have in 10 centimeters. And I found that the way to do this the most accurately is to measure the biggest number of stitches that you can and to end right at the end of a stitch, even if that doesn't translate into an exact number in centimeters. Like, it doesn't matter if it has a decimal, it's what I'm saying. So I'm going to count the stitches that I have. I'm counting 24 stitches, and that is 8.6 centimeters. And I want to know how many stitches I have in 10 centimeters, so I'm going to use the rule of 3. So here it's 10 centimeters, and here's the value that I don't know. So it's 24 times 10 divided by 8.4. So 24 times 10 divided by 8.4, and that will tell me how many stitches I have in 10 centimeters. So I'll have 28.57, and I'm going to round that to 28.6. And now let's see how many rows I have. I'm going to do the same, count the largest amount of rows that I can, and see how many centimeters I have. I have 23 rows in 5.7. So 23 in 5.7 centimeters. And I want to know how many I have in 10 centimeters, so that will be 23 times 10 divided by 5.7, 40.35, so I'm going to round to 40.4. Now to use these in my calculations, I just have to figure out how many stitches and how many rows I have in 1 centimeter. And since I know how many I have in 10 centimeters, I basically have to divide each of these numbers by 10. So I'll just be moving 1 decimal case to the left. So in terms of stitches, I will have 2.86. And in terms of rows, I will have 4.04. Let's round these. For the rows, I'll just use 4. And for the stitches, I'll use 2.9. Now let's get back to the computer so that I can show you how to make the calculations based on these numbers. Now that I know how many stitches and rows I have in 1 centimeter, as you can see here, I'm going to use these values to calculate how many stitches and rows I have in each one of these measurements. So we're going to start with the front and we'll go bottom up. Generally speaking, if a measurement is horizontal, you have to turn it into stitches, and if a measurement is vertical, you have to turn it into rows, but obviously this depends on the construction of your garment. Generally speaking, this is the rule, but obviously there might be times where you have to change it. I know that the bottom of my front piece is 23 centimeters, so I just have to multiply 23 by, in my case, the number of stitches that I have in 1 centimeter, so by 2.8, and it tells me that it's 64.4. So I'm going to round this number to 64 stitches, but later on there might be a need for me to change this depending on, for example, the type of ribbing that I'm doing. If I'm doing, for example, a 1x1 rib, I need for the bottom to be a multiple of 2 plus 1. If I'm going to do a 2x2 rib, it needs to be a multiple of 4 plus 1. So depending on that, it might need to be changed in the future, but for now we're just going to round the numbers and we'll make any corrections once we're figuring out the increase and decrease rates and all of that. Now we're going to calculate how many rows we need for the rib, so I'm just going to multiply 11 centimeters by 4 and it's 44 rows. Now let's move on to this section where we're going to increase until we get to the armhole shaping. So we know that we want to increase 2.5 centimeters, so let's calculate how many stitches that is. 2.5 times 2.8, and it's 7 stitches. And for the rows, it's 18 by 4, so we know that we have 72 rows. Let's move up, and I'm just going to insert here. It's 25.5 times 2.8, so it's 71.4. I'm going to round to 72. But actually we can check right away if this measurement checks out or not. We know that at the bottom we have 64 stitches, and here we have 64 stitches as well, since we didn't do any increases in the ribbing area. So if we're going to increase 7 stitches, it needs to be 64 plus 7, it would be 71 stitches actually. So let's change this to 71. Let's see here at the corner how many stitches we're going to cast off at the armhole shaping. So it's 1 centimeter. This one doesn't really need to be calculated. We know that in 1 centimeter we have 2.8 stitches, but I'm going to put 3 stitches here. I'm going to round it up, and now let's see for the rest. So 5 centimeters, it's 14 stitches, and 6 centimeters, it's 24 rows. Let's see how many stitches we have here in 19.5. So it's 19.5 times 2.8, it's 54.6. I'm just going to write down 55 stitches, but again, we can check it right away. We have to subtract from the 71 stitches the stitches that we're going to remove in the armhole shaping, which is -3 and minus these 14 stitches. So it's 54 stitches actually. So let's change this to 54 and let's move up. Now I'm going to start here at the neckline, so let's see how many rows we have in 7.5 centimeters. It's 30 rows. Let's see here. 2.5 times 4, it's 10 rows. And here we have 2.5 centimeters that we have to turn into stitches, so 2.5 times 2.8, it's 7 stitches. And here we have 2 plus 4, 8, and 3.5 times 2.8, it's 9.8. I'm going to input 10 stitches. Now here 1.5 times 2.8, it's 4.2, I'm going to put 4. And here 4.5 times 4, it's 18 rows. Here it's easy as well, we have 10 centimeters and we know that we have 40 rows in 10 centimeters based on our swatch. Here it's 70. In 1 centimeter we have 2.8, so I'm going to input 3 stitches, I'm going to round it up. 9.8, I'm going to round it to 10, and later on we'll see if we have to make any changes to these, but for now I'm just rounding these. Here it tells me that it's 30.8, I'm just going to put 30. Now let's move down and we're going to start calculating what's the increase and decrease rates. So let's assume that I'm going to knit these bottom up. So I'll start by the ribbing, I'll knit for 44 rows, and then when I get to this section I have to increase these 7 stitches. And I know that I have to increase 7 stitches in 72 rows. So the way that I like to calculate this is to divide the number of rows by the number of stitches. And in this case, we know that if we divide 72 by 7, it won't give us a whole number, and it needs to be a whole number because you can split stitches, so every increase rate needs to be a whole number. But we do know that if we divide 70 by 7, it gives us 10, which would be our increase rate, meaning that we'll have to increase 1 stitch every 10 rows. And then we'll have 2 rows left to work without any increases at the top, which is fine. You can also change this number to 70 if you're not worried about losing 2 rows, but I don't really find a need for it. You can just increase every 10 rows and at the end you'll have 2 rows where you won't be doing any increases or decreases here at the top. So let's write this down. You can write it whichever way makes it easier for you to understand, but I like to write it like this. So I'm going to increase 7 stitches in 70 rows. So I'm going to increase 1 stitch on each side because our front is divided at the center, but when we knit it we're going to knit it in a whole piece, so we'll have to increase on both sides of the side seam. So we're going to increase 1 stitch on each side every 10 rows, and then I'm just going to put in parentheses here, work 2 extra rows to get to 72 rows. I'm just going to put this information here. Now let's move up. So we already know that this value is correct. So let's move on to the decrease rate here at the armhole, and we'll have to decrease here because we have a number of stitches and we're going to reduce that number of stitches. But if you were working top down, at this point you would be increasing. So I'm going to decrease because I've already decided that I'm going to work bottom up, but obviously that depends on the construction of your garment specifically. So again, we're going to divide the number of rows by the number of stitches that we have to decrease in this case, and that is 24 divided by 14. Again, it doesn't give us a whole number. Okay, so here we have 2 options. We can either decrease the number of stitches that we're going to decrease here. For example, if we had 12 here, 24 divided by 12 would be 2, so that would mean that would be decreasing every 2 rows, which would be great, but we'd have to change these 2 stitches that we're going to remove here to another spot. So we can either change them to here, so instead of 3 stitches we would have 5 stitches, or we could move them up to this section, for example. Instead of 3 stitches we would be decreasing 5 stitches. We could also change the number of rows to 28, which would be a multiple of 14. So what I think that I'm going to do is change the number of stitches here to 12, so that we can decrease every 2 rows. And I'm going to move those 2 stitches to this section. I'm just going to check how many centimeters 5 stitches would be. So 5 divided by 2.8, it's 1.78. It's almost 2 centimeters instead of the 1 centimeter. But still, I think it's the change that changes the final shape the least. So now that we have 24 rows and 12 stitches, we know that we can just decrease every 2 rows. So I'm just going to copy this and change decrease, decrease, and here we're going to decrease 12 stitches in 24 rows, decrease 1 stitch on each side every 2 rows. So now let's move up to this section where we're going to decrease 3 stitches in 40 rows. So if we divide 40 by 3, again it doesn't give us a whole number, it's 13.33. Let's try 13 times 3, it's 39 rows, so we can change this number of rows to 39. and it will give us a whole number so that we can do our decrease rate. Here we're going to decrease 3 stitches in 39 rows, which is decreasing 1 stitch on each side every 13 rows. Let's just double check. So 39 divided by 3 is 13. Let's move on to the neckline. Since we have divided the neckline triangle into 2, now I'll have 2 different increase rates. I'm going to cast off 14 stitches because again this will be a full front piece, and then once I get here I'll have to decrease 10 stitches in 8 rows. That would mean that we would have to decrease more than 1 stitch in each row. For example, we could cast off 2 stitches right at the beginning, but to do that I can just change this number of stitches to 8. And I can add these 2 stitches that I removed here to here. And this way we'll have 8 stitches in 8 rows, which ends up being 1 if you divide one by the other, meaning that I'm going to decrease 1 stitch every row in this section of the neckline shapings. So let's write it down. I'm going to decrease 8 stitches in 8 rows, so I'm going to decrease 1 stitch on each side every 1 row. Let's move up to the other triangle. Here in this section we have 18 rows and we want to decrease 4 stitches, so we're going to divide 18 by 4, which again won't give us a whole number, it's 4.5. But we could... oh, actually, if I divide 16 rows by 4 stitches, it gives us a whole number, and I could move these 2 rows to the bottom, which would be 10 rows, and I initially had 10 stitches, so that would mean that again I would be decreasing 1 stitch every row, but for 10 rows instead of these 8, and I could revert this number of stitches back to the original number that was 7. So that's exactly what I'm going to do, so that I don't change the neckline at the center too much, because it's 2 stitches on each side, so it would be 4 stitches, and if we divide 4 stitches by 2.8, it tells us that would be nearly a 1.5 centimeter difference. So let's do that. I'm going to change this back to 7. I'm going to change these to 10, these to 10 as well, and here it would be 10 and 10 again, and here I can just change it to 16 without having changed the length of the neckline. I think this would be the change that makes it as close to the original shape as possible. So let's write down our decrease rate here. I'm going to decrease 4 stitches in 16 rows. And if you divide 16 by 4, it tells you that it's 4. So I'm going to decrease every 4 rows. So here's the decrease rate for this little section. Now it's time for me to check if this number of rows is correct based on the changes that I did. So we know that this whole section is 70 rows. So if we add these 2 number of rows together, it would have to be 70, which it isn't, it's 69. So let's change this to 69. And let's check this side. Basically, the amount of rows that I have on this side would again have to end up being the 69 rows, so let's check that. I'm going to add 30 rows plus 10 rows plus 16 rows plus 14 rows, and that tells me that it's 70 rows. So I'm going to remove 1 row here at the top to 13. Okay, so let me see. I don't know if I have to change the number of rows here or if I have to change it at the bottom, but if I align this, and this section is supposed to be 39 rows, and this section is 30 plus this one would be 40 rows, and it's below this one, so I'm going to change it here to 29. And here I'll keep the 14 that I had previously. Oh, I'm just going to again check the number of stitches that I have here. So it would have to be 62 stitches when we sum up all of these stitches that we have in this line here. So let's confirm. I have 7 stitches plus 10 stitches plus 4 stitches plus 30 plus 10. And it tells me that it's 61 stitches. This is what I have so far for the front. I'm going to make the same type of calculations at the back, And once I get to this top part where I'm going to do some short row shaping, I'll show you how to make these calculations. But everything else that we have already calculated, like the increase and decrease rates, I'm just going to do it by myself because I've already explained it here and I think it was easy enough to understand, so I don't think there's a necessity to repeat the process. Once I get to this short row shaping section, I'll get back to you. Let's pretend like it isn't a different day. But yeah, I'm ready to start calculating the short row shaping, and just like any other step of this pattern making process, I'm going to tell you that it's not as difficult as it might sound. I've just drawn out here an example of what short rows look like when they're being worked, and here the rows start at the bottom, but let's assume that this is the first row. When it comes to short rows, you're going to cast on all of the stitches, and then you're going to start knitting at the center a certain amount of stitches, and you're going to knit back and forth by adding a certain increment of stitches until you reach a certain number of rows that you'd like to have at the end. But what happens with short rows is that you start working on the first row, you knit until the number of stitches that you'd like to have at the center, in this case the neckline because we're working the back neckline. Then you're going to turn, and then when you get back you're going to add whatever amount of stitches that you like to add. In this case I just put 2, but once you reach those 2 stitches you're going to again turn. Then when you get to your last turn you're going to again add however many stitches you'd like. Then you're going to turn again, and as you can see, basically each turn in short row shaping happens in 2 rows. So that means that, for example, here in my work you can see that I would like to do my short rows in 36 rows, but as I've explained before, the amount of turns that I'm going to do will be half of the number of rows that I have. So when I'm calculating short rows, what I do is I divide the number of rows that I have by 2, which is 18, and then I divide the number of stitches in which I will be working the short rows by the number of turns that I'm going to do, which in this case will be 18. And if I divide 32 by 18, it gives me 1.7777, so we don't have a whole number in which we can do our short rows. So the closest whole number that we have is 2, so we could do our turns every 2 stitches, but that would mean that we would end up with less rows than 36. So if we divide 32 by 2, we have 16. So we'll have 16 turns, but that will actually be 32 rows. So we would lose 4 rows. We could do this, or we could not have an even amount of stitches in every increment. We could have, for example, a couple of rows in which we do turns every stitch instead of every 2 stitches. But I like to keep my short rows as even as possible, especially at the back shaping, because it's kind of a noticeable spot. And if you change the amount of stitches that you're doing in each increment, basically it will create a curve in your short row shaping, which isn't something that I would like to have at the back. So what I'm going to do is change the amount of rows to 32 so that I can do my turns every 2 stitches. So now I have 4 rows that I've removed in this section, so I need to add them somewhere else, which could be, for example, here. So if I lost 4 rows, it would be 36 here, and that would mean that I would have to decrease 4 stitches in 36 rows, and actually that's perfect, because that would mean that instead of doing a decrease every 8 rows, I would be doing it every 9 rows, and it's perfect. So basically short rows are calculated by dividing the amount of stitches that you'll be working on your short rows by half of the number of rows across which we'll be working the short rows. I hope that makes sense. I'm going to do the same here for the sleeve. It's not always super straightforward, it depends on the number of stitches and rows that you ended up with, and since we need whole numbers in knitting, sometimes you have to adjust and try to move stitches from one side to the other. I really recommend that you use your better judgment and considering the size of your swatch, if it will make that much of a difference in your work. So it really depends. It's really a case-by-case situation, but still it's a good rule for you to at least be able to calculate and see what you need to change in your pattern to make this work. At this point we're done with all of the pattern making, unless you like to be a little bit extra like I do. I've recently added this step to my pattern making process where I draw everything that I've sketched out in millimetric paper so that I can confirm every row and stitch if everything checks out, if I need to make any adjustments. And I've only used this for my last couple of projects. I've been really enjoying it because I can fine-tune the pattern as much as possible. I just did it right now and I ended up figuring out that I needed to add 2 extra rows that I hadn't accounted for. So if you're as much of a perfectionist as I am, I recommend that you add this to your process because because you can basically make sure that the pattern will work out before you even knit it, which is great for me because I don't like making mistakes. So yeah, now that I have my plans, I'm going to knit a version of this top, and then at the end of the video we'll compare it to the top that we've copied at the beginning of the video, so that we can see how it compares, if the measurements are similar, what's changed, what hasn't changed. So I guess I'll see you in a week. I've already started, there's just a little bit of the front right there, but yeah, I'll see you in a few days. Hey guys, so I'm fully done with making this top, and here's what it turned out like. I'm going to insert some side-by-side footage of the top that I copied and the one that I'm wearing right now. As you can see by the side-by-side comparisons, there are slight differences because the two fibers behave quite differently. The one that I'm wearing right now is much heavier, so it kind of droops down, while the wool one that I copied doesn't. It's much lighter, so it ends up having a little bit more volume, especially around the belly area. The other one kind of tightens at the rib and then has a little bit more of volume, but this one doesn't. It has a little bit, but the fabric kind of droops down because it's much more drapey than the other one. Other than that, as you can see, the construction is a little bit different because I used short row shaping for the back and for the sleeves, while the original top was constructed with increases and decreases. But as you can see, my calculations work out because we have the same shape, we have the same measurements, so yeah, this works. I hope that all of the calculations that I've shared throughout this video are helpful to your pattern making process in the future. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions, if there's any part of my process that you'd like for me to clarify. I can either write you back in a comment, or if I think that it's worth making a video, maybe I will. Making this type of educational videos feels a little bit daunting because, first of all, it's a lot of information. I know that a lot of people clicked on this video expecting that I would be teaching you how to draft a pattern, but once you get into pattern drafting, you'll understand that there's so much information. It's not a 1 hour type video that will make you understand how pattern drafting works, because you're creating flat pieces that go around a body that's 3D shaped. So yeah, I hope I made this whole process less overwhelming by copying something that already exists. And for example, right now, if I wanted to create a cardigan out of this pattern, I would just have to slice the front pattern piece down the middle and remove however much width I would be using for my button band. And yeah, I would have a cardigan out of this. So there are limitless options. I really think that the best way to learn when it comes to fiber arts is to try. You have to try, you have to test it out, you have to see what works for you, what doesn't. I hope that watching my process will guide you in some way and make this as easy as possible for you to understand. I feel like I'm just repeating myself at this point, so I'll see you on the next one. Bye!